A few years back, I woke up next to Josh, my abusive partner at the time. That morning, I wasn't doing great mentally, so I calmly told him, "Hey, I'm having a rough day. Please be kind to me today." That was enough to set him off. He exploded, throwing furniture across the room, screaming so loud it made my ears ring. He called me every disgusting name in the book, degrading me like he always did. But that day? That was different. That was the moment I completely lost hope. It was the final straw, the realization that maybe I'd never escape him. For whatever reason, he dragged me to a theme park that day. I barely spoke as I trudged along beside him, completely miserable. The bright lights, the laughter, the smell of fried food, it all felt surreal, like I wasn't even really there. At one point, we stopped to eat. The only empty seats were at a table where a married couple was already sitting. We exchanged a few polite words about the food and the park, nothing more. It was the kind of small talk you forget 5 minutes later. After we finished eating, we got up and kept wandering the park. Hours passed, and then, out of nowhere, I heard someone calling me. I turned around, and it was the woman from that couple. She waved me over. Her face was serious, almost concerned. "I don't know if you believe in this kind of thing," she said softly. "And I don't mean to scare you, but something has been following you all day. Something bad. I can see it." She locked eyes with me, searching my face for a reaction. Then she asked, "Would it be okay if I said a prayer for you?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes." She started praying, but before I could even process what was happening, Josh jumped in, hijacking the whole moment. He acted like she was talking to him, rambling about how he was struggling, how he needed help, all while forcing out some fake, pitiful tears. He had no idea she was trying to reach me. And she had no idea that just that morning, this same man had tried to violate me. That he had been doing it for years. That I was desperately hoping for even a sliver of privacy to tell her the truth, to ask for help. But I never got the chance. That was years ago. And I'm still here. Still trapped. Still suffering. Lately, though, something's been different. Something worse. A few nights ago, I woke up in the dead of night, completely alert. No grogginess, no confusion, just awake. And then I heard it. A man's voice, whispering, "Hello?" Clear as day. Josh stirred beside me, his snoring cutting off suddenly. Even our dog woke up, letting out a curious little sound. And I felt it. Eyes on me. Watching. Studying. But I was too afraid to look. I squeezed my eyes shut and lay there, frozen, until sleep finally took me again. And the nightmares? They'd been getting worse. I've always dealt with sleep paralysis, but this is different. This is evil. I dream that I'm awake in bed, unable to move, while a demonic figure, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, lurks in the room. Their faces are warped, twisted into the most hideous, demented expressions imaginable. Then the attacks begin. They mutilate me. They violate me. Or sometimes they do something even more bizarre, like tickling my armpits in a way that feels excruciatingly painful. And I can't wake up. No matter what I do, I'm trapped. Forced to endure it until the nightmare finally decides to let me go. I don't know what to do anymore. People say demons attach themselves to you when you're at your weakest. And honestly, I believe it. I've been at rock bottom for years, stuck in this awful, suffocating relationship. I know most of my suffering comes from Josh. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something else is here too, something evil, feeding off my pain. I feel it all the time. Like a dark, suffocating cloud hovering just behind me. a weight pressing down on my chest that never lifts. I feel trapped in complete and utter darkness. Growing up just 5 miles from Florida's Atlantic coast, the ocean wasn't just a place, it was in everything. The salty air worked its way into the cracks of our old house, peeling the paint like sunburned skin. The mangroves that lined the tidal creek behind our place stretched their gnarled roots into the mud, clawing at it like arthritic fingers. Even the ice cubes in our freezer carried the faintest taste of salt, as if the sea had seeped into the tap water when we weren't looking. Dad's boat, a 27-foot center console named the Sea Haven, was practically part of the family. Her hull was battle-worn with scars from barnacles, her vinyl seats cracked and weathered from years of sun exposure. But to Dad, she was sacred, polished twice a week, cared for like some people tend to a classic car or a prized guitar. Summers in Florida aren't just hot, they suffocate you. By June, the pavement sweats by mid-morning, making the asphalt shimmer like a mirage. Our weekend traditions changed with the heat. No more evening walks on Cocoa Beach, the sand cool and soft underfoot. No more long drives up to Georgia's mountains, where the air smelled of pine instead of dead jellyfish. Instead, it was just us and the Sea Haven, carving through the dark, tannin-stained waters of Mosquito Lagoon. Dad would gun the throttle, wind whipping past, his hat turned backwards so it wouldn't fly off, grinning like a kid on a roller coaster. That Friday in July was the kind of day that clung to your skin like damp gauze. The air hung thick with humidity, so dense even the dragonflies struggled to move through it. The dock planks were slick with condensation, the rope lines drooping like dead eels. In the trees, cicadas screeched their eerie, rising and falling songs, a sound so relentless it almost faded into the background, almost. Mom stood in the kitchen doorway, gripping a can of ginger ale like it was a lifeline. She called it her seasickness shield, but we all knew it wasn't helping. Her fingers had pressed little dents into the aluminum, condensation trailing down to her wrist. When Dad mentioned the trip, she forced a smile, too quick, too strained, her eyes flicking toward the boat keys jangling in his hand. "Y'all go," she said, her voice thin, unraveling at the edges. "I'll have conch fritters ready when you get back." The freezer let out a cold breath as she pried it open, fog curling around her like mist off the waves. Dad didn't need convincing. He was already halfway down the dock, flip-flops smacking against the sun-warped boards, hollering about a new sandbar he'd spotted near the Spoil Islands. "Gonna be glassy out there." And glassy meant smooth waters, meant he'd push the throttle wide open, send the boat skimming across the surface until the world blurred into streaks of seagrass and sky. I hesitated for just a second, watching Mom press the cold soda can to her temple, her lashes fluttering as the chill ran down her skin. She caught me looking and waved me off with a dish towel, a faded one with little lobsters and anchor knots. But I saw it. The way her gaze lingered on the horizon. Not afraid. But hungry. Like she was looking at something just beyond the water's edge. Something only she could see. The Sea Haven cut through the bay, its cooler packed with Dad's lime seltzers, cans slick with condensation, their tabs popping open like tiny pressurized airlocks, and my mason jar of lemonade, still pulpy, the way Mom always made it. That first sip hit sharp, the bitterness clinging to my throat like an unspoken secret. Mosquito Lagoon was alive with summer's frantic energy. Jet skis zipped across the surface like darting dragonflies, their wakes crossing in chaotic patterns. Kids screamed with laughter as schools of mullet leapt over their inflatable rafts, the fish flashing silver in the sunlight like tossed quarters. We had no idea that, by the end of the day, we wouldn't be the only ones on that island. From Rusty's wharf, its patched tin roof sagging under the weight of old license plates and fish nets tangled with plastic lobsters. The familiar twang of a country-cover band drifted over the water. The singer's voice warred against the low, guttural croaks of bullfrogs hidden in the sawgrass, their calls rising and falling like the pulse of a heartbeat. Dad eased the Sea Haven up to the dock with the confidence of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. The hull barely kissed the pilings as he tossed the rope to a sunburned teenager, his shoulders blistering red beneath faded anchor tattoos. The kid caught it with practiced ease, nodding like they had some unspoken agreement, his bare feet gripping the worn wood like someone who never known the feel of shoes. Time slipped away. We devoured blackened mahi tacos, the charred edges crumbling in our hands, tongues burning from the heat before the mango salsa cut through it with a burst of sweetness. We laughed as pelicans swooped down, mistaking our discarded lime wedges for fish, their beaks snapping shut with a sound like castanets, wings skimming the surface as if testing the water's warmth. The sun pressed us deep into the vinyl seats, the sticky material clinging to our legs like warm glue. Then, without warning, dusk arrived. The horizon bled into shades of tangerine and violet, the water catching the colors like spilled gasoline, shimmering, iridescent, and just a little dangerous. Dad raised his last seltzer in a quiet toast, the aluminum crushed slightly in his grip, condensation dripping onto his wristwatch. "Tonight's that outshine days," he murmured, voice rough from salt and sun. I lifted my lemonade and clinked it against his can, the sound hollow, ringing too sharp in the cooling air. I didn't realize, not then, that his words sounded more like a warning than a celebration. Or that his gaze lingered just a second too long on the darkening east, where the first stars began to puncture the bruised sky. And then, night swallowed everything. Darkness fell like the final curtain of a stage play, heavy and absolute. The last traces of daylight disappeared behind the spoil islands, their silhouettes jagged against the black. Dad pulled up his night cruise playlist, Springsteen's Gravel, Seeger's Rasp, and that one CCR song he swore was a requirement for every boat ride, and cranked the volume until the bass rattled my ribs, the speakers buzzing like trapped hornets. We left the lights of the marina behind, slipping into the unlit stretch where the lagoon widened into a black void. The mangroves, so alive in the daylight, shrank into nothing more than dark smudges against the sky. The Sea Haven's running lights cast rippling emerald halos across the water, their glow sinking only inches below the surface before vanishing completely, as if the lagoon swallowed the light whole. The air shifted. It was cooler now, laced with the syrupy sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. But beneath it, something sharper crept in. Something metallic, like a copper penny pressed against the tongue. It clung to the back of my throat, not quite a taste, not quite a smell, just there. Unshakable. We moved past the old lighthouse at Ponce Inlet, its skeletal frame perched over the crumbling jetty, iron ribs bared where hurricanes had stripped it down to its bones. Every 10 seconds, its beams sliced through the dark, swish, swish, turning the foam around us a stark, sterile white. For just a moment, in that sudden, clinical glow, the world looked different. Shadows twisted into things they shouldn't be. A floating log became the arch of a spine, seaweed stretching upward like grasping fingers. The pulse of light carved after images into my vision, flickering shapes that lingered even after the darkness reclaimed them. I swallowed, gripping the edge of the console hard enough to feel the fiberglass bite into my palms. "That thing's straight out of a Stephen King novel," I blurted too loud, my voice cracking like a gull's cry. Dad just smirked, his face half lit by the eerie green glow of the GPS screen. The other half remained lost in shadow. "Built in 1887, he said, like he was reciting scripture. "Back when this inlet used to swallow ships whole." He adjusted his grip on the wheel, the worn leather wrapping creaking beneath his fingers. Your great-granddad used to run supplies out to the keepers. They'd trade whiskey for snapper, fresh snapper, none of that freezer-burnt garbage. He nudged me, his calloused hand rough against my shoulder, the salt-stiff fabric of his sleeve scraping against my skin. Relax, kid. Only ghosts out here are the ones we bring with us. Dad let out a dry chuckle, but it was swallowed up by the engine's low growl. His fingers drummed against the throttle, 2 quick taps, restless, uneasy. The lighthouse beams swept across us again. And for just a second, barely the span of a heartbeat, the brickwork seemed to move. The mortar between the stones oozed black, thick as oil, trickling downward like veins filling with something rotten. Then the light passed, and it was gone. Just the tower again, its old scars frozen under the next pulse of white. I blinked hard. Maybe I imagined it. But the air felt different here. The usual salty breeze had soured, thick with something damp and stagnant, like the inside of a storm drain after a flood. Dad cut the engine. The Sea Haven fell silent so abruptly that my ears rang from the absence of sound. The click-click of cooling metal from the outboards. The hushed lap of water against the hull, soft and rhythmic, like an open-mouthed whisper. The boat rocked gently, a slow, uneasy sway. I couldn't stop staring at that lighthouse. Its rotating beams split the dark into pieces, each pass flashing over peeling paint and a rusted railing that clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. It didn't feel like a beacon anymore. It felt like a bone, something the earth had tried to bury but couldn't quite keep down. Dad rummaged through the cooler, the crack hiss of another seltzer sounding almost violent in the quiet. Trust the process, he muttered under his breath. I don't know if he was talking to me, or to the night itself. Maybe that's why I didn't hear it at first. Not over Springsteen's gravelly drawl spilling from the speakers. Not over the rhythmic slap of waves against the boat's hull, steady as a heartbeat. Then it came again. A scream. Not the rowdy whoop of some drunk tourist. Not the sharp cry of a seabird. No, this was different. It was raw. Wrecked. The kind of sound that rips something loose in your chest when you hear it. It wasn't a scream made for being heard. It was one torn from the throat of something desperate. Something in pain. I shot forward, scrambling for the stereo. Dad, kill the music! My hand smacked against the volume knob, my palms slipping on the sweat-slick plastic. Dad flinched, confused, his sunburned face creased with lines of irritation. But there was something else beneath it, something wary. The music cut off, and suddenly, the quiet felt too heavy. Like the whole world had been muffled under a thick wool blanket, suffocating even the sound of the waves. Someone's out there, I whispered, my voice barely making it past the tightness in my throat. Every hair on my arm stood on end. Dad's easy grin from earlier had vanished. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles blanched white, fingers stiff as if frozen mid-motion. The scream came again, closer this time. Or maybe the water was playing tricks, bending the sound like glass under pressure. A woman's voice. Fraying into a sob. My gaze snapped toward the island ahead. Just a jagged smudge in the moonlight, half lost in the mist curling off the water like smoke from an extinguished fire. No boats. No lights. Just that dark silhouette, its shoreline clawed by hungry currents. Currents strong enough to flip a kayak in seconds, to drag a body down where the crabs could do their work unseen. We didn't move. Didn't even breathe. The Sea Haven rocked beneath us, its slow, steady creaks the only sound breaking the stillness. It felt mocking. Come on, it seemed to say. Go see. I counted the seconds. 10. 20. 40. Nothing. The lagoon stretched out before us like a sheet of black glass, smooth and silent. No life jacket bobbing in the waves. No hands breaking the surface, fingers splayed and desperate. Just the island. Waiting. The water around it looked wrong. Too still, too thick, as if it was holding its breath. Then, "Help!" The cry shredded through the night. Brittle. Splintered. Real. Dad fumbled for the spotlight, his movements suddenly clumsy, unsure. The beam wobbled over the water, light skimming across the surface. It caught the flicker of tiny baitfish, flashing silver as they scattered, fleeing from something. Then the light hit the shoreline. The island loomed in stark white, all jagged coral and twisted sea grape trees. The leaves shimmered like blades in the glow, catching the light in sharp, metallic edges. But there was no woman. Only the trees. The rocks. The shoreline clawing at the water's edge like something trying to pull itself free. And yet, that scream. It had come from right there. "Where are you?" Dad and I shouted in unison, our voices brittle against the vastness, swallowed whole by the dark like the lagoon had no bottom, no edges, just an endless void. Then the reply came, tearing through the silence. "Being followed!" Followed? My mind caught on the word, tumbling over it like a foot snag on a root. Dad's voice sharpened. "Are you on the island?" The spotlight jolted across the shore, catching skeletal driftwood, shadows twitching at the edges like something alive. And then, a scream. A sound so jagged, so raw, it felt like it had teeth. It scraped against my skin, set every nerve on edge. My pulse slammed in my ears, and before I even processed it, the answer came, strangled but unmistakable. "Yes." Dad didn't hesitate. The engine roared to life, shredding the silence apart. The sudden violence of it sent a cormorant flailing from the reeds, wings beating in a blind panic. The sea haven surged forward, bow cutting into the black water, waves pounding the hull hard enough to rattle my ribs. The cliffs loomed ahead, limestone glowing ghostly white in the spotlight's glare, pitted and worn like bone. The closer we got, the more the island changed. The wind howled through the rocks, whistling through gaps like breath through broken teeth. Dad cut the engine 20 yards out, letting the hull drift as he threw anchor. The chains scraped against stone, metal grinding on rock. Then the water lit up. Tiny blue sparks shimmered where the waves hit the hull. Bioluminescent algae flaring to life for just a heartbeat before fading into the dark. It looked like the ocean was exhaling light, as if something beneath was stirring. Up close, the island felt wrong. Wild. Seaweed clung to the cliffs like rotting hair, thick with the stink of salt and decay. The trees leaned at broken angles, their exposed roots curled and twisted like tendons, bark peeling away in sickly patches. The air was heavier here, thick, damp, carrying the smell of something that had been dead a long time. No footprints in the sand. No torn fabric caught on branches. No sign that anyone had been here at all. Only the wind, slithering through the sawgrass and a slow, hissing breath. We yanked on the rubber boots Dad kept stashed in the sea haven's compartment, stiff with mildew, soles worn smooth. I climbed out first, shirtless, the jagged rocks digging into my palms as I steadied myself. My boots slipped on algae-slick stone, each step treacherous. Dad's flashlight cut ahead, a shaky yellow beam, more fragile than I wanted it to be. The darkness thickened around its edges, pooling in the gaps, swallowing what the light couldn't reach. "Call out!" Dad ordered, his voice harsher than I'd ever heard it. We both did. "Hello? Can you hear us?" The light jerked over the gnarled tree trunks, skimmed across tide pools that reflected our warped faces back at us, surfaces rippling with the frantic movement of shrimp. No response. The chill crawling up my spine had nothing to do with the night air. It settled deep, threaded itself through my ribs. She could be hurt, I said, but the words felt weak the second they left my mouth. Hollow. Like saying them out loud made them less true. Or trapped. Dad's jaw tightened, the muscle flexing like a lion under too much weight. He swung the flashlight inland, cutting through dense undergrowth, revealing spiderwebs stretched between sea-graped leaves, their silk gleaming like hanging nooses. We moved together, boots crunching through broken shells and driftwood, calling into the void. Hello? The island drank our voices. The ground softened beneath us, thick with tidal muck that squelched underfoot, releasing a stench, sulfur, rotting vegetation, something deeper, something worse. The smell of a body buried where the earth never quite let it rest. As we pressed forward, the air thickened, cloying with the smell of damp limestone, salt rot, and something old. Mangroves crowded in close, their roots pushing up like grasping fingers, bark peeling in curling sheets. Dad shouted again. Can you hear us? The cliffs threw his voice back at us, warped, stretched, our own words twisted, mangled, like the island was mocking us. Then, a sound. Not distant. Close. Human, but not right. Strangled. Choked. Like someone trying to scream with a mouth full of kelp. My entire body locked up, like I'd been hit with a live wire. Dad froze beside me, the flashlight jerking in his grip, its beam twitching over the roots, now looking less like trees and more like coiled snakes. Either of us spoke. We ran. And the island fought us back. Sawgrass whipped at my arms, slicing thin, stinging lines into my skin. In the moonlight the blood looked black. Sand spurs latched onto my jeans, their tiny barbs digging deep, and my boots slid across moss-slick rocks, every step a gamble between balance and disaster. Dad's flashlight swung wildly ahead, its frantic beam carving shifting shapes from the trees, gnarled figures hunched in the underbrush, reaching hands that vanished the second the light swept past. My lungs burned. Salt and iron coated my tongue. But the scream, that scream, kept me running. Even as the island's terrain turned mean, the ground buckling into deep cracks tangled with sea wrack, even as jagged limestone threatened to twist my ankle with every misstep, I couldn't stop. I burst onto the eastern shore, doubled over, gasping. The flashlight beam jittered over the rocks, over tide pools crawling with frantic crabs, over barnacle-crusted boulders that gaped like rows of tiny, toothless mouths. Nothing. No body washed up in the surf. No footprints in the damp sand. No torn fabric snagged on the branches. Just the moon above, cold and indifferent, and that silence. It wasn't normal silence. It was thick, smug, pressing into my eardrums like the island itself was satisfied. Like it had devoured the woman whole and was now licking its lips. Dad stumbled up beside me, sweat shining on his face like mercury. He looked like he wanted to curse, to rationalize what we had just heard, but no words came. The flashlight flickered. The darkness around us felt like it was getting stronger, feeding on the batteries, draining the power straight into the hungry ground beneath us. We stood there, shaking, our hearts still hammering, the screams still echoing in our skulls. Had we imagined it? The thoughts slithered in, cold and unwelcome. The mangroves swayed, but there was no wind. Their roots creaked, joints popping like old bones. My own flashlight quivered in my grip, its plastic casing flexing under the pressure of my white-knuckled hold. I turned it toward the shoreline, watching as the beam carved through the dark, shadows scattering like roaches from an open flame. And then I saw it, hanging from the mangrove branches, swaying gently. Strands of seaweed. Not caught on the limbs, not tangled in the bark. Hanging. Like something had put them there. The tide lapped at the rocks, foam hissing between gaps in the stone like breath through clenched teeth. And that's when I saw it, standing at the water's edge. Not human. Not animal. A thing of angles and voids, its silhouette a mockery of anatomy, like someone had taken bones and arranged them at random, uncaring if the shape made sense. Moonlight glazed its emaciated frame, ribs curving inward like sides, joints swollen and twisted, legs spiraled wrong, like something had wrung them out with giant hands. Its skin, if that's what it was, glistened wetly, slick and rippling as if made of mercury disturbed by invisible fingers. Its head lolled backward, neck tendons straining like a ship's rigging caught in a storm. But its eyes, black, bottomless voids, stared straight into the sky, drinking in the moonlight without reflecting an ounce of it. And then, slowly, horribly, it turned toward us. The movement was liquid, boneless, its spine rolling like a sea whip caught in a riptide. My flashlight caught its face. Or what should have been a face. A collapsed star of features, eyes swirling with shifting mercury, a mouth too small, too precise, a razor-slit opening. And then it spoke. "You found me." The voice was hers. The same pitch, the same panic, except wrong. Distorted. As if dragged through waterlogged speakers, the words coming apart at the edges. It didn't resonate in the air. It slithered. Straight into my gut. Cold and invasive as something alive, coiling inside me. My knees buckled. Dad's fingers latched onto my arm, a vice grip, nails biting hard enough to bruise. "Run!" No hesitation. No questions. We ran. Boots skidding on slime-slicked rock, lungs burning, breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Behind us, the thing's voice followed, twisting, warping. "Help me!" It was unraveling now. The words fraying, breaking apart. "Help me!" The syllables splintered. Clicks and hisses coiled beneath them, not human sounds, layered together, overlapping, a dozen voices fused and torn apart. The cry gurgled, thickened, wet, like a throat filling with seawater. A sound deeper than fear. A sound older than words. And we ran faster. This was something deeper than fear. This was prey knowledge. The hare's certainty that the fox's teeth were already at its neck. That the chase was just ritual. We didn't look back. Didn't dare. The island ripped at us, undergrowth clawing at our clothes, sand spurs sinking into our skin like fishhooks. My wrist stung where thorns had bitten deep. Every breath burned raw in my throat, thick with salt and copper. Dad's gasps came rough and rhythmic beside me, his boots pounding the ground, steps faltering in the shifting sand. Ahead, the sea haven rocked in the dark, its running lights casting pale halos on the black water. It looked like a mirage. Like something too far. The hull groaned against the anchor line, waves hammering it against the current, the ocean itself trying to pull it back. Behind us, the cries changed. Less words now. More vibration. A subsonic hum so deep it rattled my molars, blurred my vision like heat distortion. I risked one glance. It stood at the tree line. Not chasing. Just watching. Its body had folded itself wrong, crouched low, joints twisted. Its arms were longer now, stretched like mangrove roots, fingers flared wide, each tip curved into a spine. Its head tilted at an impossible angle. As if listening. As if learning. Its mouth, the razor-thin slit that shouldn't be a mouth, peeled wider, curling at the edges. A smile. Or a promise. We hit the deck of the sea haven like men escaping a blast zone, limbs colliding, breath coming too fast. Dad fumbled for the anchor line, hands slick, slipping on the wet rope. "Come on, come on, come on!" The rope fought him, the fibers groaning as if the island itself was trying to keep us here. Then, finally, Snap. The anchor surfaced, trailing black sludge that smelled of rot, thick clumps dripping like congealed blood, strands of seagrass tangled in the flukes like hair. Dad slammed the throttle forward. The engine screamed. RPMs redlined, the boat launching forward, stern kicking up a wave of churning foam. Bioluminescence flared in our wake, blue-green ghosts swirling through the water, forming shapes that might have been faces. Or hands. I gripped the gunwale, fingers locked tight, refusing to look back. But its voice still found us. "Come back!" The words cracked sharp across the waves. Too perfect. Too clean. My blood ran cold. That wasn't a cry for help. That was a hunter testing the call of its prey. "I need help." The tone shifted. Too polished. Too precise. Like a music box wound too tight, its lullaby warping into something broken. A performance. A pantomime of distress, laced with something giddy, something venomous. Dad didn't slow. Didn't speak. Just kept one hand locked on the wheel, the other white-knuckled around the throttle, pushing the engine so hard it whined. We cleared the channel markers. Cleared the reef. Cleared that place. And still, the echo of its voice clung to my skin, trailing after us like seaweed tangled around an ankle. What we encountered that night does not fit logic. But if you're reading this, if you're skimming Florida's barrier islands at dusk, cocktail in hand, laughter spilling over the rails like something the night can't wait to devour, then heed this. When the wind carries a cry from some lonely spit of sand, when your gut knots at the too perfect pitch of that, "Help me!" do not answer. Do not slow. Do not listen. Flood the engine. Steer clear. And pray the current takes you somewhere else. Pray harder. Every night, my town locks down for 12 minutes. I finally learned why. You ever been to one of those towns where everyone knows your name? Where the coffee at the local diner comes in mugs stamped with your initials, and people wave when they pass you on the street? A place where families have been here for generations, where nothing much changes. That's my town. It's quiet, a little rustic, hell, half the time, the internet barely works, but it's home. The kind of place where time feels like it's standing still. Except for the nights. The nights here are different. I used to love this town. Spent my whole life here, never thought much about leaving. Every place has its little quirks, right? But there's one here that isn't like anywhere else. See, every night, without fail, at 11:38 p.m., this town locks down. I'm not talking about folks heading home for the night, turning off porch lights, calling it a day. I mean a real lockdown. Doors slammed shut. Windows rattle as bolts slide into place. The streets empty completely. It's like the whole town has rehearsed this 1,000 times, like instinct. We don't go outside. We don't look outside. And for exactly 12 minutes, something outside tries to get in. No one ever sees it. Not directly. But we all know. An eerie silence grips the streets, thick and unnatural, like the whole town is holding its breath. And then, as fast as it comes, it's gone. At 11:50 p.m., everything goes back to normal. People don't talk about it much. When they do, they whisper. "It's just the way things are," they say. "It's always been like this." But I know better. I know because I've seen it. The first time was when I was 10, maybe 11. I'd stayed up late reading comics, curled under my blanket with a flashlight. My parents had the same rule every other family had: go to bed early, and if you wake up, stay inside. No open windows. No unlocked doors. That night, I was doing just that. Following the rules. Then I heard it. A low, guttural hum, deep enough that I felt it vibrate through the walls. It wasn't a car. Wasn't thunder. It was wrong. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the window and peeked outside. The street was empty, not a single soul in sight. But something was out there. I couldn't explain it. I still can't. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. It moved wrong, with jerky, unnatural motions like a puppet controlled by too many strings. The air around it seemed to bend, like heat rising off asphalt, making my head pound. My eyes struggled to focus on it, like they weren't supposed to see it at all. And then there was the hunger. A feeling so overwhelming it made my skin crawl. Like whatever it was looking. Waiting. I don't know how long I stared. My body wouldn't move, locked in some kind of hypnotic daze. And then, just like that, it was gone. The next thing I remember, it was nearly midnight. I crawled into bed, pulled the covers over my head, and pretended I had never looked. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone. But I never forgot. I haven't seen it again since that night. But I feel it. Every night, at 11:38 p.m. on the dot, when the town locks down, I know it's there. We all do. We pretend we don't. We act like it's just a curfew, like there's nothing outside. But we know better. And those who don't? Those who doubt it, who think it's just some old town superstition, they don't last long. People disappear all the time. Too often for a town this small. The police put on a show when it's an outsider, search parties, flyers stapled to telephone poles, interviews on the local news. But when it's one of us, it's different. There's no search. No questions. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Another family reprimanded for not locking up in time. And no one ever speaks their name again. I don't know why it only lasts 12 minutes. Maybe we're lucky. Maybe we're not. All I know is that at 11:50 p.m. it ends. The streets go still. The air feels normal again. The town pretends everything is fine. But it's not. It never was. People here have learned to live with it. They lock their doors. Shut their windows. Pretend it's not happening. I once asked my parents why we didn't just move. They never gave me a good answer. It wouldn't do any good. My mom finally said, her voice flat, her eyes avoiding mine. We have to endure. It has to be here. It's safer for everyone if it's here. That made no sense. I knew people got attached to places, but this wasn't about sentiment. It was bigger than that. It was something deeper, something no one wanted to explain. But I couldn't pretend. Not after what I'd seen. Not after what I'd felt. There was something out there, and it was worse than anyone would believe. I hadn't seen it again in years. Not directly. But every night, at 11:38 p.m., I could feel it. And then, just recently, I saw it again. It was supposed to be a normal night, as normal as nights can be here. I was getting ready for bed when I realized Quincy was missing. My cat. At first, I thought he was curled up somewhere in the house, but after searching every damn room, I couldn't find him. And then I heard something. A soft thump outside. I went to the window, and my heart sank. Quincy was outside. My stomach clenched. I must have let him slip past me earlier without realizing it. Now he was just sauntering along the sidewalk, completely oblivious. The time was 11:36 p.m. I had no idea if the creature ever went after animals, but I wasn't about to find out. I opened the window and whispered his name, trying not to let my voice carry. He didn't listen. He never did. I called louder. Nothing. Panic set in. I had minutes, before the lockdown started. Before it arrived. I didn't think. I just ran. The second my bare feet hit the pavement, I realized how stupid this was. But it was too late. I sprinted toward Quincy, arms outstretched, heart hammering. "Come on, buddy! Come here, please!" I scooped him up. And then I froze. A presence. I felt it before I saw it. The air thickened, pressing against my chest. Quincy's ears flattened against his skull, and he hissed, claws digging into my arm. And then I saw it. Not like before. This time, it was bigger. Its presence filled the entire street, pressing against houses, curling around door frames, slithering beneath the streetlights like an unseeing tide. My legs refused to move. I tried to breathe, but my chest locked tight. And then, it turned toward me. Its head twisted, jerking in unnatural angles, like it was just figuring out how to use its own body. My stomach flipped as its shape began to change, its grotesque, impossible form morphing, coalescing into something that looked almost human. But it wasn't human. The moment our eyes met, my entire body screamed in protest. The sheer wrongness of it sent me staggering backward. Quincy yowled and bolted, slipping free, his tiny form disappearing into the darkness. But it didn't care about him. It was looking at me now. Its mouth peeled open, a thin, slicing wound across its face, an unnatural slit that stretched too wide, revealing nothing inside. And then it moved. Not walked. Not ran. Moved. A sick, wet slapping sound echoed through the street, like flesh dragging across pavement. My breath hitched. Run. I turned and sprinted. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs, so hard I thought my chest might split open. A roar erupted behind me, deafening, unnatural, shaking the ground. I didn't look back. I couldn't. No one I knew had ever been outside during the 12 minutes and lived. I veered into an alley, pressing myself against the cold brick, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. I forced my breathing down, biting my lip until I tasted blood. And then I heard them. Screams. Not mine. Someone else was out there. The sounds were short, sharp, then gone. Swallowed by the night. I squeezed my eyes shut, hands clenched into fists, trying to make myself small. The air shifted, heavy with something unnatural, something wrong. And then, just like that, silence. A deep, suffocating stillness. I waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. Then I heard it moving away. The slapping, wet sound receding. By 11:50 p.m., it was gone. And yet, the quiet that followed wasn't normal. It was something left behind, something that clung to my skin like oil. I ran back home. Every step felt like I was still being chased. Quincy was waiting at the door. The second I opened it, he bolted inside, tail puffed up, eyes wild. I slammed the door, locking every bolt. We didn't sleep that night. And after what I saw, I don't think I ever will again. That night left me shaken, but grateful to be alive. Whatever that thing is, it does not belong in this world. It is not of this place or time, and catching even a glimpse of it leaves a dull, throbbing ache in your skull, like your mind itself is rejecting its existence. No one knows where it came from. Maybe its origins have been lost to history. But it remains. Always there. Always waiting. Lurking in the shadows every night without fail. At that point, I did the one thing you're probably thinking I should have done years ago. I left. I packed my bags and ran. I moved to the biggest city I could find, far away from the town and its cursed rituals. My parents didn't approve. In fact, they tried to tell me I couldn't go. You don't understand, my dad said, gripping my arm a little too tightly. It's not that simple. But I didn't care. I was done living in fear. So I snuck out before dawn, when they couldn't stop me. For the first time in my life, I felt free. City life was a relief. The constant hum of traffic, the endless murmur of people, the neon lights flickering outside my window, it made me feel safe, anonymous. I convinced myself I had left the nightmare behind. That whatever the creature was, it was a memory now. A relic of my past, something I could bury. My new apartment was small but comfortable, a cozy studio on the 5th floor. From my window, I could see the bustling streets below, glowing with headlights and neon signs. High enough that looking outside at night didn't fill me with dread. At least, that's what I thought. Then, last night happened. And I realized the truth. I never left it behind. It followed me. It started like any other night. I sat at the edge of my bed, flipping through a magazine, trying to distract myself from the creeping unease that still clung to me, even here. The clock on my nightstand read 11:28 p.m. I told myself I was just being paranoid. That I was safe now. That the creature was gone. By 11:38 p.m., something changed. The noise of the city, the distant honking, the laughter, the music drifting from bars below, just stopped. I frowned. Listened harder. Nothing. Not even the usual rumble of late-night traffic. Just an unnatural silence, thick and waiting. I tried to shake it off, focus on the magazine. But my eyes kept drifting toward the window. The darkness outside felt wrong, like it was pressing against the glass. Then I heard it. A tap. Soft. Tentative. My breath caught. The magazine slipped from my hands, landing on the floor with a quiet thump. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again. A second tap, louder this time. More insistent. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The darkness outside my window seemed to pulse. The tapping stopped. And then, a scratch. Long and slow, claws dragging across glass. My body locked up. I knew that sound. I knew what it meant. Slowly, legs trembling beneath me, I rose from the bed. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the window, my hand inches from the curtain. I could leave it closed. I could ignore it. But some awful, compulsive need forced me forward. I gritted my teeth, took a shaky breath, and yanked the curtain open. And then I saw it. Perched on the fire escape, its twisted form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Its limbs were stretched and unnatural, like something had tried to make a human shape but got it all wrong. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed with a cold, pulsing light, a color that didn't belong in this world. And even through the glass, its presence pressed against me, flooding the room with an unspeakable horror. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The creature tilted its head, its gaze locked onto mine. A wave of dread washed over me. It had found me. I took a step backward. Its mouth opened. Rows of jagged, needle-like teeth glinted in the dim light, the wound of a mouse stretching too wide, too deep. Then, a growl. Low. Guttural. A warning. A promise. The moment shattered. My paralysis broke and I staggered back, my voice finally breaking free in a raw, terrified scream. The creature's form seemed to blur, shifting like it was struggling to hold itself together. The darkness in my room deepened, thick and suffocating, like it was pulling me in. And then, everything went black. I woke up on the floor. Cold. Disoriented. The last thing I remembered was the creature, its eyes glowing through the window, its mouth peeling open, its presence pressing in on me. Then darkness. But I wasn't dead. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't over. It was never over. I sat up, hard hammering, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My apartment was still intact. No shattered glass, no broken doors, but something felt different. The air was heavier, thick with something unseen, something watching. And then I remembered what my parents had told me, all those years ago. It is safer for everyone if it's here. I used to think they meant us. That the town was some kind of refuge, a place where we knew how to survive. But now, with cold, creeping horror, I realized what they really meant. They weren't saying it was safer for us. They were saying it was safer for everyone else. They knew the danger. They stayed to keep it contained, to trap it. And I had just let it out. Somehow, it had known. It had felt my absence. And it had followed me. To a city of millions. A city that wasn't prepared for it. A city that would soon learn the truth. I stumbled toward the window, my limbs still shaking. Below, the streets buzzed with normal life. Cars moving, people walking, neon signs flickering in the night. Oblivious. They had no idea what was coming. I gripped the windowsill, guilt twisting in my gut. I had made a terrible mistake. And now, I might have doomed us all. I don't know if I can stop it. I don't know if it can be stopped at all. But I do know this. For your own safety, stay inside between 11:38 p.m. and 11:50 p.m. By now. It might not be safe wherever you are either. For years she had lived alone. No husband. No children. Just the house, the garden, and the silence. A quiet so deep it wrapped around her like a warm blanket, comforting and familiar. Mornings were spent in the garden, her garden, where roses bloomed in clusters of crimson and white. She hummed to herself as she trimmed the leaves, the scent of fresh soil mixing with the gentle splash of water against the earth. She had never needed more than this, and she liked it that way. But lately, things hadn't felt right. At first, it was just small things. A chair slightly out of place. A picture frame shifted just a few inches. Little things. And then, the laughter. Soft. Light. A child's giggle floating through the halls in the dead of night, when the house should have been silent. She told herself it was the wind. Just her imagination. But the more she tried to ignore it, the louder it became. Then came the footsteps. Little feet, light and quick, padding across the old floorboards upstairs. But she had no children. She was alone. And then the voices came. A man and a woman, arguing in a distant room she could never quite find. We should leave. We can't just go. We've spent everything on this house. The words sent a chill through her spine, rattled the very walls around her. She pressed her hands to her ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the noises only grew louder. Until, one night, she snapped. "Leave me alone!" She screamed into the empty house, her voice cracking, filled with a frustration she couldn't quite explain. And just like that, silence. The house went still. For the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, thinking she had finally rid herself of whatever had haunted her. Until the next morning. She stepped outside and saw them. A family, a man, a woman, and a child, stood on the front lawn, staring at the house. They were whispering to each other, eyes wide, uneasy. Her breath caught in her throat. They could see her. The woman shivered, turning to her husband. I think this house is haunted. The words sent an icy shiver down her spine. She wasn't haunting the house. She was the house. She had always lived here. Hadn't she? They didn't need to know her. They didn't need to see her. But then, they called a psychic. The psychic stood still in the doorway, eyes closed, listening. And then she smiled. She's not haunting the house, the psychic said gently. She's part of it. Her heart skipped a beat. What did she mean? The psychic turned her gaze toward the garden, where the roses stood tall and bright, blooming as they always had. She just loves the garden, she murmured. The family stared at the rows of crimson and white, uncertain, but the child, her eyes wide with wonder, stepped forward, drawn toward the flowers. And in that moment, she felt it. Her fingers brushed against the windowpane. She hadn't even realized she was standing there, watching. And suddenly it all made sense. The laughter, the voices, the moving objects. It was never the house that had been haunted. It had been her. All this time. The wind rustled through the garden, and the roses swayed with it, whispering softly in the breeze. But this time, the laughter wasn't frightening. It was warm, like an old friend, returning after a long absence. The house was hers, and she would always care for it.